Yeah, so thank you all for joining us. I am obviously, you know, that I'm here with Christian Picciolini, the host of HGTV's Extreme Home Makeover. And we're
Extreme racist makeover.
Yes. So, Christian Picciolini, you are the founder of the Free Radicals Project, the co-founder of the Life After Hate movement. You are in the process of making an MSNBC docu-series, Breaking Hate. We're going to talk all about your work, but you have a pretty fascinating life story. So I've read your memoir, listened to your memoir, White American Youth.
Thank you.
You've got a really interesting, fascinating story. Can you please tell it to me in 5 minutes or less?
All right.
And why don't we cue actually some of these images?
Okay. So my journey away from violent extremism began 23 years ago when I was 22 years old. But before that, I was this guy, this 8th grader who was about to turn 14, who for 14 years had been bullied, who felt abandoned by my parents, who didn't have any friends, and was frankly very lonely and introverted. And I had a hard time. My parents are Italian immigrants. They moved from Italy in the mid-'60s, and they were often the victims of prejudice when they arrived. But because they were immigrants, they had to work very, very hard. So they managed to open a small business. And they were gone 7 days a week, 14 hours a day, really trying to do the right thing. I mean, now I don't blame them, but growing up, I kind of wondered, what did I do to push them away? And I certainly wasn't mature or brave enough to kind of approach it. So I just got angry, and I got very resentful, and I started to act out pretty badly. And one day when I was 14, this age here, I was standing in an alley and I was smoking a joint, and a man pulled up in a car, and he came out and he had a shaved head and he was wearing boots. And the year was 1987. I didn't know what a skinhead was. Nobody really in America knew what a skinhead was at that time. And he walked up to me, pulled the joint out of my mouth, looked me in the eyes, and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." I was 14. I didn't know what a communist was. You know, the guy in the Rocky movie, Drago, was really the only Russian that I knew. My favorite movie.
This is a deep cut for the post-millennials.
Totally, yeah. And I didn't know what a Jewish person was. I went to a Catholic school. I wouldn't have known if I'd come across anybody. And I didn't even know what the word docile meant. I was literally 2 weeks before that sitting in my grandparents' closet, drawing pictures and playing with baseball cards. I had no concept of what racism or politics was. But that moment, although it started off as aggressive and kind of scolding me, turned very quickly into him putting his hand on my shoulder and asking me my name. And I told him, and he recognized it was Italian, and he said, your ancestors are great warriors and thinkers and artists, and you should be very proud of that. And I was. I grew up in an Italian family in an Italian neighborhood with other people from the same villages. It was pretty much all I knew. In fact, at that point, I thought if you weren't Italian, you weren't good enough. Like, I thought only Italians were, cool, because I didn't know anybody else. So you really appealed to this sense of, this making me a hero or promising me paradise. And but then it would kind of turn into, and there are people that want to take that away from you, and it's, the Jews and the communists and the Latinos and the immigrants and everybody else. So it very quickly ramped up, and of course I didn't want to seem stupid, and I wanted to belong. It was the first time I'd ever had any acceptance. And it did provide a family for me. It provided me with an identity, a community, and a purpose, something that I think is a pretty foundational search for all of us at some point in our lives. And they did provide that to me before, it became very self-destructive.
Yeah. So you went from innocent kid, with the...
I went from Chachi.
Yep.
To the next picture, to Nazi. Almost overnight. I mean, this is maybe 15 and a half, 16 years old. I had sprouted a little bit. I wasn't just a short kid anymore. But what this did almost overnight was adopting this look and this rhetoric. Now all the people that had tormented me would avoid me. And suddenly I felt powerful. Of course, it was perceived power. It wasn't real. It wasn't respect. It was fear. But for a kid who felt powerless his whole life to suddenly experience this power and control, I was pretty intoxicated by it.
I want to dwell on that for a moment. So listening to you describe this story, you were a bruiser, right? I mean, you got into a lot of fights.
I did.
And there are a number of passages in your book about fights that you got into, and particularly there are a few times when you tell the story of coming up against like bad odds in a fight and overcoming. And listening to you tell that story, it was hard not to wonder, was any piece of you today telling that story proud of this kid that could get with his best friend and clear out a room full of football players?
No. The very quick answer is no. I was very ashamed writing my book because I had to go through those experiences again. But I was also very conscious about writing the book in the voice of who I was at that time, and you can see it progress throughout the book. I didn't want to seem like an intellectual when I was 15 years old, because I wasn't. I was very crass, and I would say words to provoke people. I think I really wanted to be as genuine and as sincere as possible. My goal is not to glamorize it in any way. It certainly was, the opposite of that. But I also wanted it to seem so real that people could be there. And I hope I did a good job of that, to pull people in and really experience kind of viscerally what it is that I went through and what it is that I put people through, because that was really the hardest thing for me to kind of verbalize. And re-empathize kind of these really awful situations for the victim.
Within that context, so you are hanging out with some of the earliest skinheads, Nazi skinheads in America at the time, and I'm curious, how was your masculinity policed? What could you and couldn't you do? What kind of...
Well, my parents are still married, but my dad was really never around. He was, always running a business, and I didn't really have a father figure growing up. And even so, I think my dad was a pretty timid guy, and not somebody I looked up to growing up. I resented him a lot, actually, for not being there. So I didn't really have kind of that, that fundamental how to be a man type thing, and how to be a good man, especially. So I was raised, once I got into this movement, around a lot of very toxic masculinity, a lot of misogyny. On the outside, the marketing tactic was to praise white women because they were the saviors of the white race. They were going to birth the next generation of warriors. This is a lot like ISIS, if you haven't picked that up already. Outwardly, they would put them on a pedestal. However, in reality, once they had them, they were treated, frankly, worse than our enemies were. They were made to, make babies. They were treated horribly. They were abused. It was not a safe place. Women were drawn to it. Women who were broken, I think, were drawn to it because they thought it was going to provide this very traditional sense of structure, because they believe in, quote unquote, traditional values. But it was completely the opposite of that. It was a male-dominated, very misogynistic environment where actually a lot of women were physically and sexually abused by people in the movement.
So you were you're a teenager, and you got this group, you got a crew.
Yeah, so by now I was, 17, I think, and this was in Germany, and where I had taken a band. I'd started one of America's first bands, and we were the first band to leave the U.S. to play.
Not one of America's first bands.
Sorry, in this genre, in this hate music genre, and we were the first band to travel outside Germany. And by this point, I had started to really kind of amass a leadership. The guy who recruited me in that alley, Clark Martel, was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead leader. He had brought it over from England, and he had gone to prison for a series of very violent crimes by the time I was 16.
Your relationship with Clark Martel is another one of those things that comes out in the book. I found myself thinking about Susan Faluti's book about the Citadel. When the Citadel was being integrated, when Shannon Faulkner was integrating the then all-male Citadel, it was hugely controversial. The cadets, the alumni, they wanted to know, they were kicked up a big fuss, and Susan Faluti wanted to ask the question, why was this so, why was it so threatening to have a woman here? And part of what, at least my interpretation of what she found, was that she found a context where the femininity, what had been coded as feminine, had been narrowed to such a stretch that they had had etiquette lessons for men, where if you saw a hint of precipitation, you should take your coat off and put it on the ground.
Chivalry, right?
And so, having narrowed the definition of what it meant to be feminine that thin, the bounds of what it meant to be masculine expanded. And so you had these men, these brothers who were also sisters to each other and also mothers and fathers to each other. And I'm curious, what was that dynamic like within your crew and with Clark Martel?
It was like that to some degree. There was this illusion of this family, but it was a dysfunctional family. I mean, there was nothing positive about it other than you had other people that were as broken as you to share their company with. Misery loves company, so it was not about bringing people that were better than us. It was about bringing people that we thought we could control, otherwise we wouldn't be able to feel good about ourselves. Because so much of this is driven by self-hatred, and we hated ourselves for our brokenness, that we would project that pain that we were feeling onto other people so that we didn't have to feel it. And if we made other people feel worse than we did, sometimes for some people that was the only way they could feel good about themselves. And my relationship with Clark was of a father to son. I didn't have a great relationship with my dad, but Clark was also very mentally ill. It started to become very apparent to me that he was kind of going off the rails. When he went to prison, he would send me, photographs that he would draw that were very pornographic and write these kind of sexual stories. And then at one point, he had tried to castrate himself in prison and smeared himself with feces and, was saluting around until they put him in the psych ward. But he was absolutely mentally ill, and that actually mental illness is pretty rampant in the movement.
So, do you think, in that basis, was it? Is there a certain profile of a person who's susceptible? What was it?
I think every young person who is searching for identity, community, and purpose, if on their life's journey they hit what I call potholes, the traumas, the abuse, growing up with, in a socioeconomic depressed environment, seeing your father die, or commit suicide or being raped when you were 3, all these things, these potholes, if we don't have the right resources or can properly navigate around them, sometimes we get detoured down these dark alleys where there are people waiting for us because they know that we're easier to manipulate because we've never experienced some of the joys in life, and they can promise those things. And like I said, to a degree, they do deliver. They did give me an identity. I went from a nobody to a somebody. Yeah. I went from no family to this very, what I thought was a very loving and supporting family, and I certainly had a purpose. It was not a good one, but it was the only one I'd ever known. And frankly, I thought I was a humanitarian during, the early years.
Let's dive into that for a moment. So take us into, I want to go into the ideology. One aspect of it that you touched on, but I wanted to return to, is white. Your parents immigrated to the U.S. from Italy. It was not always obvious, certainly for several of my Italian American friends, it was not always obvious that they got to fully claim that label for themselves. Yeah. It is the first title, the first word in your memoir. How did you come to understand yourself fully as white and not a quote-unquote white ethnic?
Well, I can explain it from the perspective of the movement. They were interested in people of European heritage who were Gentiles, who were not Jewish, meaning Greeks, Spaniards, Italians. But for me, I always kind of had that question myself because I didn't understand. When I was a little kid, I was Italian, and white people were white. As I grew up, then obviously, incorporating into society, I started to feel myself being white, and then I started to resent my parents for being immigrants because I was so angry at them that now I had to punish them for feeling abandoned.
So what were you protecting? What was this? What was the ideology? What was the movement? Why did you feel like a humanitarian hero?
The number one fear rhetoric piece that they would promote is this idea of a white genocide, that because of multiculturalism, that the white race would eventually disappear. And that if we didn't stand up for it now and eliminate the enemies who wanted to promote this Jewish multicultural conspiracy to destroy the white race, sounds ridiculous because it is, we were afraid, and we thought, wow, there are all these enemies. Everybody was painted as a criminal, as an animal, as a monster, as a parasite. These words really don't change over the last 30 years. Some of the same, we're hearing some of the same rhetoric now. Yeah. It's always about painting the other as kind of this, subhuman parasite.
So this concept, this is one of the most confusing things to me about white supremacy. So there are a lot of different groups of populations around the world who have, in living memory, historical reasons to be concerned about the threat of genocide. And I'm not like oppression Olympicsing you or trying to oppression shame you or anything like that, but white Americans, not in living memory, there's not that many historical. This is one group that, it's not like you're looking at the history books like, it could be that again.
Yeah, they've got a long history of these genocides.
Right, yeah. Yes. There are a lot of groups who have the living memory of genocide. Why is it such a palpable threat? How did it become such a palpable threat?
Because sometimes equality to the people who have control seems like oppression. What's happening in America right now when some white people are saying, we're losing and we're going to be overrun and all these people are coming in and we're going to lose this sense of white identity, which is a fear tactic that these recruiters use. What they don't understand is that they've always enjoyed the power, the control, historically, around the world. And now that things are finally equalizing, they're not losing anything, things are finally equalizing, or at least getting, moving in that direction. I'm not suggesting things are equal right now. I think we have a lot of problems. And for somebody who maybe, is driven by some of this fear rhetoric, it could be a scary thing. If that's your reality, and I always say that if I went to school and I had a twin brother, and he went to a different school from the day we were born, and they taught me that 2 + 2 is 4. For my whole academic career. But at his school, they taught him that 2 + 2 was 5 for his whole academic career. When we would come together, we would argue to the death because that's his reality and I had mine. And unfortunately, we're living kind of in an America where there are two different realities, two sets of facts. Alternate facts, real facts, whatever we're calling them these days. And the truth is there, no truth is that cut and dry. There's always a nuance to it. But they're very good at making it very unidimensional, black and white, and it's easier to blame that way.
So one of the dimensions of the book that's quite interesting is that you do kind of dive in detail into the story, the full narrative. And it's almost like, if you are familiar with like Millennial theology, it is almost like a raptured narrative. It's like Revelations. It's this vision of the future that you were painted. It feels like a piece of speculative fiction in some ways.
Yeah, it was. It was about painting the apocalypse. We thought the race war was inevitable. We thought that You know, a second American Civil War was just around the corner.
Were there prophets like there are in end times theology now? I mean, was there like a date where people saying like on August 23rd, 1987?
There were some. I mean, there were some who were so deep in the conspiracy theory mindset that, you know, there were, you know, these kind of people who they would listen to. But, you know, I don't think so. You know, I don't recall anybody. But we would always be prepared because it could be tomorrow. You know, anytime a new law passed, you know, and we're talking about all these laws that are being passed now, you know, Supreme Court justices and immigration and separation of families. In those days, it was kind of the opposite. Anytime we would see a positive policy for society, we saw that as a threat to us. Yeah. And every time we saw that threat, it would push us closer to that, you know, that perceived race war that was just around the corner. So we stockpiled weapons. We trained. You know, we were ready, but we were living in this paranoid fantasy world that, you know, we were marginalized, and that's why we went into these groups. But what we didn't recognize is that we became uber marginalized by going into these groups, you know, kind of going further away from society, and it detached us from reality even more.
Yeah, so let's keep going with your story then. What was, I mean, take us to doubt. When did you start to wonder about the world beyond this crazy end time story you had found yourself in?
About a week after I was recruited in that alley. I mean, I always had doubts. I wasn't raised that way, so everything was very foreign to me. But at first I didn't want to ask questions. I just nodded my head, pretended I understood everything because I didn't want to seem stupid. You know, I already felt from the day I was, you know, a little kid that I was stupid. And I certainly wasn't going to show that kind of vulnerability to any of my peers at that point. So I had questions every day of those 8 years that I was involved. But I always pushed them down because, you know, that power that I felt from that identity, community, and purpose that I was enjoying was much, much stronger than kind of my reason to do right. Even though I had that voice in the back of my head, I pushed it away, you know, because I was addicted. It was like being on drugs. Yeah. And to go away from that was to go away from comfort and to have to start over. But not only to have to start over, but to have to start over with my former friends hating me and the rest of the world still thinking I was a racist. So for many people, it's very easy to stay, go along with the program, be more violent, and enjoy this, you know, whatever, you know, perks they have of being part of this.
So in the book, you describe in some ways a series of catalysts that each kind of build on one another to reinforce. So there's your meeting your first wife, your girlfriend, first wife,
yeah.
Lisa.
Yeah, coming back from that Germany trip, I met a girl, fell in love, was 19 years old, and we got married, and we had our first son at 19 and our second son at 21, and that was really the first time that my sense of identity, community, and purpose was challenged. You know, was I a hate monger, or was I a father and a husband? Was the community the one that I'd surrounded myself with to boost my own ego, or was it, you know, the one that I had given life to? And, you know, did I want to continue to scorch the earth as my purpose, or was it to actually, you know, provide for my family in a safe environment and, you know, watch them be healthy and educated? And I really struggled with that. I was not brave enough, unfortunately, to make the right decision, though. I didn't leave fast enough, and my wife and children left me.
Yeah. You started a music store.
Yeah.
This generated an income for you. But there was this moment, there's this crossroads that happens in the book that I wanted to ask you about, which is you were offered a chance to become the leader of the Northern Hammerskins. So the bureaucracy, the hierarchy that you describe in the book, you kind of sketch out pieces of it, but I don't quite understand the org chart of the org.
So at 14 years old, I went to my first meeting, which was our group in Chicago meeting with some other new skinheads from Detroit and Milwaukee and Dallas. And the Dallas skinheads had this idea. They had named their group the Hammerskins. And they wanted to, now that groups were popping up all over the country, they wanted to kind of bring everybody into this umbrella and call it the Hammerskin Nation. And the Northern Hammerskins was the northern states, and then at that time Canada as well. And I became the leader of that and was in charge of several hundred people. And today the Hammerskins are known as the deadliest and most violent American hate group.
So this moment, I mean, they were offering you, how old were you when you were offered?
I think I was 16 or 17. Yeah, 17, I think.
What would that have meant in terms of practical support, financial resources? How did you meet? How did you organize?
Right.
Were there PowerPoint presentations? What?
I don't think there were any PowerPoints, but it was meetings. We couldn't gather in VFW halls or anything like that, so it would be, in somebody's basement or apartment or some warehouse or something like that, and people would typically come in from all over the country. And there was no internet back then. So
what would it have meant for you if you had taken, I'm going to spoiler alert, you didn't become the leader of the Northern Hammerskins, but what would it have meant for you if you had? What set of responsibilities would have accrued to you?
I would have essentially been the CEO of probably 12 states and all the Hammerskin groups within those states. Hammerskins at that time considered themselves the elite of the white supremacists. There were rules about not doing drugs and treating your comrades with respect and all these things. So I handled the marketing. I handled. There were no finances.
Marketing?
Yes, propaganda, I should say. We call it marketing today.
Did you?
Well, I started a band, and that was the way that was my propaganda. So in the lyrics was education, it was incitement to violence, it was conspiracy theory.
Got it.
And in concerts, when people would come from all over the country and you'd get a couple hundred people or a couple thousand people, it was like a pep rally. It was a way to kind of re-energize people, refocus them, make them angrier, remind them who the enemy was, and frankly get them, fueled up with a bunch of liquor and let them loose. And it was at that concert in Germany, though, actually, where I recognized for the first time the impact and the consequences of my words, because before that it had been on a small scale with just some friends, but these 4,000 skinheads that came from all over Europe went out into the town after I sang my lyrics, and they essentially destroyed it. And not only did they destroy, property, but they beat up townspeople who were white and German. And suddenly I was like, okay, this is not a movement with a purpose or an ideology. This is just a movement to destroy. And it was like an epiphany for me in some ways that this is not who I wanted to be associated with.
Yeah. Another aspect, among these different catalysts that kind of pulled you out progressively, you're having children, this moment in Germany. Another was this moment in the store. So you had this music store and you described yourself for the first time being a small business owner dependent on a community, customers.
Right.
And one of those customers was a guy named Black Sammy.
Yeah.
Who was actually black.
Black Sammy, who was actually black.
And he walks into your store.
And he walks into my store, and Black Sammy was an anti-racist skinhead. So for folks that might not know this, there are different types of skinheads. Normally when we hear about skinheads or think about them, we think of, mild kind, the Nazis or white supremacists. But in fact, there are groups of skinheads that are very against racism. Some that are, there are gay skinheads. There are all different kind of subcultures within this skinhead movement.
And there were at the time too.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they started in kind of opposition to us.
How similar or different was that from today's dynamic between? Would Black Sammy today have been maybe like Antifa?
Yes, that is the progression of what we used to call sharps, skinheads against, or they call themselves sharps, skinheads against racial prejudice.
So if you're not familiar with this term today, they use the term Antifa, anti-fascist, which is controversial.
Yeah, they're protesters that essentially we hear about when the Nazis march. They're the ones out there. We hear narratives of them being violent, and I've known many of them, and they're not all violent. There are some, which I don't agree with. But yeah, that would be the progression. So there were these anti-fascist groups that opposed us, and Black Sammy was one of them. But however, he was a black skinhead with a swastika tattooed on his forehead. Also mentally ill. his friends didn't understand him. I didn't quite understand him. But in this moment, he came into my store, and I reached for a pistol because I knew that this was going to be a showdown. And it wasn't. Instead, he came in to buy music, and we talked, and I recognized that this was just a normal guy that I actually had a lot in common with.
But was really into white power music.
Yeah, he was just kind of a strange guy. He was into white power music, but he was also, very anti-racist as well.
So I want to talk for a moment. We'll probably take a midway break. Midway through our conversation, I'll probably break for one or two questions. So be thinking of the things that you want to ask. But I want to focus in on the movement itself, and particularly contrasts and comparisons with today, and
Good
what
question.
we see in today's politics. One question I'm curious about, from your vantage point. So I imagine you sort of keep tabs, given your work, on the spread of extremism in the world now.
I do.
There is certainly a perception. I mean, I'm an editor. I think I forgot to mention that I'm Matt Thompson, the executive editor of The Atlantic. There is certainly a perception that that extremism is growing, and groups that keep tabs on extremism, like the Southern Poverty Law Center, have been charting rises in the number of hate groups and hate incidents in the U.S. as they define them. But from your vantage point, do we have more extremism now, or is it just drawing more attention?
It's always been there. For anybody who thinks that there's no racism, or that we went through a period where racism didn't exist, I can tell you that is absolutely not true. It's shifted. 30 years ago, we had this concept called leaderless resistance that not only is now known as kind of a lone wolf strategy, but we encouraged people to drop their visible edginess. Don't shave your heads, don't get swastika tattoos, grow your hair out, trade in your boots for suits, go to college campuses to recruit where young people are forming opinions, where they're joining and looking for new communities, get jobs in law enforcement, go to the military and get training, and even run for office. And I have to admit, I'm the first one who thought it would never work. But here we are 30 years later, and the similarities in the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House and even the policies, I could tell you we would have, and they are jumping for joy, but we would have jumped for joy 30 years ago because it was so in line and so similar to what we wanted. We wanted to build a wall. We wanted to tear families apart. We wanted to ban Muslims and Jews and all that stuff. And if we heard that now, I know for a fact it's emboldening so many people who maybe didn't have a clear idea of what their hateful ideology was before, but now it's become crystal clear because they can back tangible policies and a tangible president and a tangible administration. And I can tell you that it's become a very disturbing, growing social movement for kind of young, marginalized white kids, both male and female.
Is one of the questions that I think I certainly grapple with a lot in our work as a journalism outlet is, what is the strategy? How does attention work when it comes to spreading extremism or alerting the world to it? Should we feature these stories, or should we ignore them? There's this one document that I'm curious about, and I wanted to mention in particular. This document purporting to be a style guide for the website The Daily Stormer, which is one of these an extremist, very violent rhetoric.
It's a pretty vile white supremacist website. Yeah.
This thing that surprised me about this document is how well the authors of the document seem to get the media. I mean, how well they seem to understand the dynamics of just the nuts and bolts. They have a style guide, which is a concept that's pretty familiar to me in my work. And that style guide offers guidance on things like the use of humor and its effectiveness in softening a message that may otherwise seem to be extreme. So many of those tactics are about sort of cheeky ways of commanding attention, doing light acts of trollery and what have you. And we have real questions about what's the right what is the ethical, effective way to respond to that?
I think we need to talk about it. We need to shed light on it, but I think that there's a way to do it to not glorify it or make it, seem to some kid sitting in some basement, who's having trouble, like that's something that he wants to do or she wants to do. There are two things that extremists love, not just Nazis, but all extremists. They love silence and they love violence. If we're silent, if we ignore them, they grow. They just kind of flourish, they can spread and infect people with this kind of, false propaganda and conspiracy theory. And if we're violent to them, which I've seen happen, many times, we're playing right into their hands because that's exactly what they want. They march in places like Charlottesville and Berkeley and Skokie, Illinois back in the 70s because they're progressive communities. And they go there intentionally to provoke people into violence because then they use it as a victim narrative. They'll say things like, do you see how my rights were being taken away? How my free speech was, stepped on, and how I'm being targeted as a white male as the greatest endangered species on earth that they claim exists. So it feeds right into their narrative, and they use that to recruit more people. So we have to hold them accountable. I believe in being vocal, visible, vigilant, but not violent. And if we can do all those things and hold them accountable, show them that we oppose them, but not adopt their tactics, while also keeping in the back of our mind that the only thing that can stop hate is compassion, that's how we win, and we don't play into their hands.
I want to come back to the work that you do today, but I'm curious about the other day on social media, there was floating around this the latest Department of Homeland Security press release, or one of the press releases from the Department of Homeland Security. And several people theorized. Well, tell me about how you encountered
I was one
this
of
press
them.
release. What was the story of this press release?
So I came across, somebody else had posted it and I saw it, and it was the Department of Homeland Security's website. And on one of their recent kind of immigration postings or blogs, the headline on it, and I'm totally going to misquote this, but it was, "We must secure our borders and expel immigrants to protect our country." It was 14 words, and if somebody's not familiar with the 14 words, it's a mantra for the white supremacist movement that goes, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." The DHS one was eerily similar, also 14 words. I mean, you can make your own decision. It's certainly not, I don't have any facts that somebody, was a Nazi that wrote that, but it seems very suspicious to me that with this administration, somebody trolling, that somebody kind of do that, or was it intentional, is a little frightening for me.
Part of me wonders just about that ambiguity, because it seems, I would not have had that. And several other people responded in the moment on social media, on Twitter, to point out a whole range of different press releases through a bunch of different administrations using the phrase "we must secure." I'm sure some of those titles might have been 14 words. And there's this question of, at what point am I being paranoid, or at what point is this part of the strategy, or?
Well, I contacted DHS. I contacted the folks I know there, and they admitted to me it was troubling language, and they were going to look into it. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if, it was a total coincidence or not, but, there are all these really odd coincidences and actions and tactics that they're using that I just can't ignore anymore.
But for us ordinary people in the world who have not been necessarily conditioned to see
It's what you call a dog whistle
everywhere, right? How are we supposed to process that ambiguity? How widely should we be looking for secret swastikas?
I'm not trying to start a conspiracy theory, but for somebody like me who's hypersensitive to seeing all the similarities that exist, I can't ignore them, and I have to call them out. I'm not making any assumptions about things that I don't see or that I don't think exist, because I don't believe in inflaming the conversation. But I also believe in being honest. I get asked all the time, is the Trump administration racist? I don't know, but I can judge by their policies that it's hurting people of color. So if that makes them racist, that makes them racist. I mean, I don't know what to say to that other than I'm witnessing things that I would have supported 30 years ago, that I know that white nationalists, whatever fancy name they're using now, that they're applauding it, and that it's in line with their ideology, and it's certainly allowing them to grow and become normalized and emboldened and frankly just blend in. We're at a time where we don't even know. There might be some here right now and you wouldn't know it because they look just like you. And they didn't look like I did 30 years ago. But they're also being influenced by this kind of extreme right, the Roger Stones of the world and the Bannons of the world, who very clearly have these kind of isolationist, anti-immigrant kind of theories.
After one more question to Christian, I'm going to turn to y'all for a couple of questions. But why did you, in your current work, you are still, you're engaged with this stuff. What was the process like of getting from the moment that you left the movement to continuing to work in that environment, in that terrain? Did you have to take a break from it? Was it continuous? At what point did you become a de-radicalizer? Did you switch from a radical to a de-radicalizer?
I ran from my past for 5 years after I left. I was ashamed. I was too afraid of being judged the same way that I had judged people, and I didn't know who I was or where I belonged anymore. I was treating other people with respect because I had started to receive compassion from the people I least deserved it from, at a time I least deserved it, and that really kind of connected me to them and destroyed the demonization. But after I left, closed my store, lost my wife and my children, I went through a depression for 5 years because I didn't know who I was anymore. I was treating other people with a ton of respect. I was treating myself very, very poorly because I still had self-hatred. I still had not learned how to deal with that. And it took me a long time until a friend came up to me and she said, I'd been waking up mornings like not wanting to wake up. And she said, I don't want to see you die. Go apply for a job where, I just started working. And then she told me it was a company called IBM, and I told her she was crazy. Because here I was, this ex-Nazi who had gone to 6 high schools, gotten kicked out of all of them, one of them twice, didn't go to college, didn't even own a computer. I mean, it was kind of like a waste of time. But I went, and they asked me back. I got another interview, and I got the job. And it was an entry-level job, but I was thrilled. I was going to be installing computers and networks and businesses and school districts, and then they told me where I'd be going for my first day of work, and I was terrified. It was my old high school, the same one I'd gotten kicked out of twice. Destiny, karma, fate, God's will, whatever you believe in. I mean, I was like, wanted to crawl in a hole because I thought I was going to walk into this school, and even though it had been 8 years since I'd gone to that school and 5 years after I left, somebody was going to recognize me and remember the things that I did. And who happens to walk by me in the first hour while I'm trying to avoid everybody? But it was the old African-American security guard, Mr. Johnny Holmes, who I had actually gotten in a fist fight with, and that got me kicked out the second time and dragged out in handcuffs.
That's the one fight you lost in that book.
No, I didn't. I won that fight.
Oh, that was the fight you won? Oh.
Yeah.
But
just to finish that story, it was really him who saved my life, because I decided at that moment, even though I had no idea what I was going to say and I was sweating and like this nervous wreck, I followed him to the parking lot, and when I saw him, he recognized me and he took a step back, and I told him I was sorry. I didn't know what else to say, and we talked, and we shook hands and embraced and cried, and he made me promise that I would tell my stories, and I've been telling it for almost 20 years.
So I'm going to turn to you all for questions. I will stress that word, questions. And if you do have a comment, I will probably need to be de-radicalized by Christian. So the mic runner will come right over here.
Hi. The only comment I'll start with, and I do have a question, is we spend so much of our lives trying to hide what we're not proud of, and I am just absolutely touched and moved by your courage. So thank you. My question, which I think is going to sound really ignorant, you were
not as ignorant as I used to be, so go ahead.
You were saying that a lot of the movement is to be prepared. Prepared for what? Like what is the call? Was it take up your arms and do what? Like what is the preparation for, and to do what to whom? In what way?
Well, I think like any extremist group, cult, it was preparing for the end times, right? It was preparing for the end of the world that we thought was inevitable. Whether that was one group thinking that they were going to die and go, to heaven for 40 virgins, or us going to Valhalla where we would, drink and fight all day and feast all night, or you'd go to paradise. That was it. We had no view of the future because we had never experienced hope. So the end of the world for these groups that have no view of what hope is kind of like that's their hope. Oh, I'm going to die and I'm going to go to a better place. We should make a better place here while we're here, I think.
All right. How about right up here?
What do you think of Morris Dees and the work that he's done?
Sorry, we've got a mic coming to you. Yeah, here you
Morris
go.
Dees, yeah.
What do you think of Morris Dees and the Southern Poverty, the work that he does? And secondly, has your life been threatened by these people for many years?
I get death threats every day, more than one. I'm sure if I looked at my phone now, I probably have one. And I've been getting them for as long as I can remember. But you know what? I was willing to really lay down my life for something that was extremely stupid and didn't make any sense 30 years ago. If somebody wants to hurt me for doing the right thing, it's not going to deter me from doing the right thing. So, well, I guess it is what it is. As far as Morris Dees goes, I think, he's got an amazing history of challenging these groups. I don't think that any organization, even the Southern Poverty Law Center, is perfect. This is a complicated issue where sometimes we make mistakes. But I think historically, if you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, they've been one of the champions pointing out this, along with groups like the Anti-Defamation League, who really are, the best at identifying these trends and profiling these groups so that people like me know about them, people like you know about them, and we don't continue to sweep it under the rug thinking we're living in a post-racial society.
Yeah. So. There is... you work with a range of different types of ideologies and extremists today. So you've worked with former people who come out of ISIS, in addition to white. Is there anything distinct about white supremacy movements from, say, ISIS?
There's some nuance, but I think foundationally it's, people join, get involved for the same reasons. They're looking for acceptance. They're looking to be part of something that's bigger than themselves, and in the real world, they haven't been able to find that. They stay in for the same reasons because it's way too hard to abandon that sense of who you are and start over. But they also come out for the same reasons. They come out because, they've had an instance or multiple instances where they've had the ability to humanize the people that they think are the enemy. And I've heard this hundreds of times. I've helped over 175 people at various stages of disengaging from extremism, ISIS, far right, neo-Nazis, things like that. And I can tell you every single person I've talked to, when I've asked them, why did you join? They all say, I just wanted to be accepted. And if you ask them why they got out, they say, I received compassion from the people I least deserved it from when I least deserved it. That's not to say it is the responsibility of people of color to do this, because it's dangerous. But frankly, we don't know who extremists are anymore. They could be sitting here. We should just be compassionate to everybody, because we don't know who we're going to affect.
175 people you brought out of that lifestyle and ideology
at various stages. Yeah.
Do you weight the scale from the people that you brought in and the people that you've brought out?
It's hard. I still to this day am pulling out weeds from all those seeds that I planted. I changed it. I didn't only hurt my victims, but I hurt the people whose lives I changed. The 16-year-old kids who probably would have had a normal life, but I brought them into this, and maybe they ended up in prison or dead, or really ingrained.
How much did the movement grow when you were in it?
Oh, it grew very fast, very quickly. It grew very large, very quickly. It was kind of the thing to do if you were a punk rocker and were tired of punk rock. You would go to maybe a more extreme thing. and young people extremist hop. I've known so many like extreme leftists who are now extreme Nazis, and extreme Nazis who've become extreme leftists, and we even know neo-Nazis who've become ISIS members, and it's like they just are. Ideology and dogma is not driving this. It is not what is radicalizing people. I was radicalized from the first day I was born. Those potholes radicalized me. The ideology just gave me a license to be angry. It gave me the permission slip. But I could have gone any direction. Yeah, I mean, it is growing. I think that there are a lot of disillusioned young people. I think we're failing young people. I think we make it too hard for them to succeed. I think we need to be vulnerable with our children so they can learn to be vulnerable with us. Teachers need to be vulnerable with their students so that students can be vulnerable. We've created this kind of whole suit of armor for adults that we're superheroes and we know everything. We don't know everything. We make a lot of mistakes. Young people are idealistic and they may not know all the answers, but they're not stupid either. And I think that we owe them the opportunity to amplify their passions and hear their voices because maybe they're not as jaded as we are.
So you have, you've built a new life for yourself. You're doing this work over the past 20 years. You have a wife who is here with us right here, Britain. And you have your children.
My kids are going to be 26 and 24 this year.
How did you, with your understanding that anyone could be pulled into this, and also given the fact that some of their earliest years were while you were in the movement, what did you do as a father to try to avoid them taking the path that you took?
My wife left me when the kids were just 3 and 1, so they never really saw that involvement, but I was also very careful about not bringing it home. My wife was not involved. I never tried to push it on my family or my kids because I think deep down inside I knew how ugly and broken it was. And while I thought, okay, I'll just carry them on my shoulders and I'll do it, something inside of me knew to keep it away from them. But unfortunately, I didn't disengage quickly enough.
You lost a brother.
Yeah.
Your younger brother, Buddy. I guess what did you, from that experience, what is the thing that you wish you had, I guess, as an older brother to yourself?
Yeah, good question. So my brother was shot and killed because he was trying to follow in my footsteps. I had already left the movement, and he didn't go down the exact same path that I did, but it was still a very self-destructive gang environment. And my brother was really nothing like me. I was more kind of always the idealistic go-getter, and he was kind of the cuddly, follower that just made everybody laugh. But I left a legacy that he felt he needed to live up to. And he got involved with some folks that, were into some bad stuff, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was shot and killed by a black gang member. And I just remember going to his funeral, just being completely heartbroken that I just lost my brother. And there were people that, I'd known, family members that were begging me to take action because they expected me to be that killer, that person that went and got revenge. And frankly, it was the last thing that was on my mind. I just wanted my brother back,
But is there anything with your knowledge that you think you could have done? Is there any way that you could have filled those potholes that...
I really abandoned my brother like my parents abandoned me. I kind of went through that cycle again. At 19, I was married and had children, so I was already starting my own family. My brother was 10 years younger than me, so we were very close before I joined the movement. He was kind of like he was my only friend until I was 14. And then when I was 14, I had this new life and this new trajectory, and then I had my own family, and I really kind of left my brother behind. And, by the time I came back and I was, I got my senses together and I recognized what he was in, he said to me, like, "You're not my brother, you're my uncle. I hardly see you. I don't even talk to you." And I did feel very, very responsible for his death because I felt like if I was there for him, that he wouldn't have needed to go down that path. And I still hold those feelings. I don't blame myself for it, but I've learned not to. But I think that we abandon people for our own interests and sometimes don't look back, but sometimes, even though those people are quiet, they're the ones who are screaming the loudest for our attention, and I think we need to pay attention to those quiet screams a little bit better.
Let me take one more question. I want to make sure I'm looking around the room since I have favored this side over here. How about right here in the third row? Yes.
What can be done to reverse the course of those members to get them out? What is, at a political, grassroots, at whatever level, what can be done?
Good question. First of all, we all have the tools to do it because it is not an ideological debate. I don't ever engage with anybody that I work with on an ideological level. I don't argue with them. I don't tell them they're wrong. I want to, trust me, but I know that that just pushes them further away. It creates more polarization. Instead, I listen, and I listen for those potholes, those things that were broken, those voids in their lives. And I say, see the child, not the monster, because it doesn't matter if it's a 6-year-old or a 60-year-old, it still always stems from that brokenness, usually the trauma in youth. And I listen, and then I fill in those potholes. I will provide connections to job trainers or life coaches, mental health therapists, tattoo removal, whatever they need, and sometimes it's a lot. And I listen because they've never had anybody listen to them. And I have this kind of special ability to filter out all the BS that they tell me because frankly, I used to say it at 14 and it sounds really ridiculous to me now. So I'm able to kind of pinpoint the important parts. And they tell me and they don't even know that they're telling me. And then I start to ask questions, personal questions. They'll ask me about the Holocaust and I'll say, what's your relationship like with your dad? And they're like, oh, well, my dad committed suicide when I was 4. And I was like, that's a pothole, we need to work on that. So I create kind of this assessment based on building human resilience. Because when people are happy, they don't plant bombs. When they feel whole and self-confident, they're not, creeping down an alley to beat up a homeless person or something like that. And my goal is really to build them up so they don't have to blame the other. But again, I challenge them by introducing them eventually to the people they think that they hate. Holocaust deniers and Holocaust survivors I've sat with for hours, and Islamophobes and imams and homophobes and LGBTQ communities. And I tell you, every time the demonization that exists in their head, it's impossible for it not to become destroyed when they're faced with somebody who does not fit that profile. And the more that happens, the more questions come up, and then eventually you just can't reconcile the prejudice anymore.
And so now you're working on this series, Breaking Hate with MSNBC, and putatively we will get to see this process actually
You will get to see the process unfold August 12th on MSNBC. It's a docu-series, so a documentary series. It's not like a reality show. It's not scripted. And I work with an individual who I think most people here would look at and say, that person's a monster. I mean, this is a man with swastikas tattooed on his face. And this was a man who was at Charlottesville for the rally. And this is a man who made an amazing transformation, and I won't spoil it for you because I think it is going to be the most powerful, most heartwarming and kind of mind-melding TV experience that you've ever seen. I really do believe that.
All right. Next Queer Eye. Christian Picciolini, thank you very much for sharing this with us today. Thanks to all of you for spending your Friday evening figuring out how to get de-radicalized.
Thank you.